Ethan Parker, a fresh nursing graduate, was hired to care for a millionaire in a vegetative state, on the brink of death. With every step he took into the luxurious mansion, the weight of the situation pressed heavily on him. But then, something strange happened. Ethan noticed a subtle movement in Henry Blackwell's body, something no one believed possible. Could this be the first sign of a miracle? Or just a desperate illusion? Join us to discover the shocking twists and turns in this gripping story, where hope and doubt collide. Before continuing the story, tell me which city you're watching from. I want to know how far this video has come. And don't forget to like and subscribe to the channel so I can send you exciting stories like this every day. Ethan Parker nervously adjusted the collar of the borrowed uniform as the elevator rose to the penthouse of the luxurious skyscraper. His trembling fingers desperately tried to smooth out the wrinkles of the ill-fitting fabric. The young 25-year-old nurse, fresh out of school and from humble origins, felt the weight of responsibility on his shoulders. His thoughts wandered to his mother, battling cancer in a hospital while he prepared to care for one of the wealthiest men in the city. "You can do this, Ethan. This job is the only chance to save Mom, the way you'll be able to pay for all her treatment." "Don't mess it up," he murmured to himself, trying to calm his racing heart. The elevator doors opened silently, revealing an opulent entrance hall that made Ethan swallow hard. Persian rugs, works of art that seemed to be worth more than he would earn in his entire life, and an oppressive silence that made each of his footsteps seem like an intrusion. He approached the main door hesitantly, raising his hand to knock when it opened abruptly. Sophia Blackwell, the millionaire Henry's daughter, stood there, her cold eyes sizing Ethan up from head to toe. "You must be the new nurse. I hope you're more competent than your appearance suggests," she said, her voice as cutting as ice. Ethan felt his cheeks burn with shame, but he forced a professional smile. "Yes, ma'am, I'm Ethan Parker. I'm here to take care of Mr. Blackwell." He extended his hand, which Sophia completely ignored, spinning on her heels and motioning for him to follow her. As they walked down the luxurious hallway, Ethan couldn't help but think, "My God, what am I doing here? I don't belong in this world." Sophia stopped abruptly, turning to face Ethan with a severe expression. Her icy blue eyes seemed to pierce the young nurse's soul. "Before we enter my father's room, let me make a few things clear," she began, her voice low and threatening. "This job requires absolute discretion and confidentiality. What you see, hear, or discover within these walls must never leave here. Do you understand?" Ethan nodded quickly, feeling a lump form in his throat. Sophia continued, her tone growing even harsher. "Any mistake, any slip-up, no matter how small, will result in your immediate dismissal. There will be no second chance. Are we clear?" she asked. The young nurse swallowed hard, feeling the weight of Sophia's words. He knew he couldn't afford to lose this job. His mother's life depended on it. "Yes, ma'am, I understand perfectly. I promise I'll do my best and maintain the strictest confidentiality," Ethan responded, his voice sounding firmer than he felt inside. His thoughts, however, were a whirlwind of worry and determination. "No matter what happens, I can't fail. Mom needs me and I won't let her down." Satisfied with his answer, Sophia opened the door to the master bedroom, revealing a space that looked more like a luxury intensive care unit. Ethan entered, his eyes wide at the impressive amount of state-of-the-art medical equipment. Monitors, infusion pumps, ventilators. Everything seemed brand new and more advanced than anything he had seen during his internships at the university hospital. In the center of it all, lying on a comfortable-looking hospital bed, was Henry Blackwell. The contrast between the sophistication of the equipment and the frailty of the man in the bed was striking. Henry, once a powerful businessman, now looked small and vulnerable, his pale skin almost blending in with the crisp white sheets. Tubes and wires connected him to the machines that kept him alive, each beep and hum reminding everyone of the precariousness of his condition. Ethan felt a wave of compassion wash over him. He may be rich, but in the end, we're all equal in the face of illness and death, he thought. Sophia broke the silence, her voice now laced with an emotion Ethan couldn't quite decipher, perhaps a mixture of sadness and frustration. "My father has been like this for 3 months. The doctors say it's a vegetative state, but we refuse to give up. She turned to Ethan, her eyes suddenly bright with unshed tears. "Your task is to take care of him, monitor his vitals, and inform us of any change, no matter how small. Do you understand?" Ethan nodded solemnly, feeling the weight of responsibility settle on his shoulders. "Yes, ma'am. I'll do everything in my power to care for Mr. Blackwell." He approached the bed, beginning to check the monitors and record the vital signs on a nearby clipboard. His movements were precise and professional, years of training taking over. As he worked, he couldn't help but think, "If I could do half of this for my mom, sir." No focus, Ethan. One step at a time. As Ethan performed his initial checks, Sophia watched him intently, her arms crossed and her posture rigid. She seemed to be evaluating every move the young nurse made, ready to point out any mistake. The silence in the room was broken only by the rhythmic beeps of the machines and Henry's soft, artificial breathing. Ethan tried to remain calm, but he could feel beads of sweat forming on his forehead. "Take deep breaths. You've studied for this. You know what you're doing," he told himself. After a few minutes of silent observation, Sophia finally spoke, her voice a bit softer than before. "I'll leave you to familiarize yourself with the equipment and routine. The family doctor, Samuel Green, will come by later to discuss the case in detail." She paused, looking at her father with an expression that mingled love and despair. "Please take good care of him. He is all we have." With those words, she turned and left the room, leaving Ethan alone with Henry and the constant hum of the machines. Now alone in the room, Ethan let out a long, trembling sigh, allowing himself a moment of vulnerability. He looked at Henry, studying the face of the man who, until a few months ago, was known in the papers for his strength and determination in business. "Mr. Blackwell," Ethan murmured softly. "I don't know if you can hear me, but I promise I'll do my best to take care of you. Together we'll fight to bring you back." He paused, feeling an unexpected connection with the patient. "You know my mother is sick too. I understand what your family's going through." Ethan continued his meticulous work, checking every piece of equipment, adjusting tubes, and ensuring Henry was comfortable. As he performed these tasks, he couldn't help but notice the wealth of detail in the room. Family photos in silver frames, a bookshelf filled with books that looked like they had never been opened, and a window with a view of the city that stretched as far as the eye could see. It was a constant reminder of the world Henry belonged to, so different from his own. What must it be like to have all this? And yet here he is, as powerless as any of us, Ethan thought, adjusting a pillow. The hours ticked by slowly, Ethan alternating between checking vital signs, administering medications, and performing basic care. He spoke to Henry occasionally, telling him about the weather outside, or commenting on the news that played silently on the flat-screen TV on the wall. It was a practice he had learned during his rotations. Even comatose patients might sometimes hear and benefit from the interaction. "Who knows, Mr. Blackwell? Maybe you can hear me, and if you can, I want you to know you're not alone. We're all here waiting for you to come back," Ethan said softly, checking the drip of one of the intravenous medications. It was during one of those routine checks that it happened. Ethan was leaning over Henry when he noticed something. A movement so subtle that for a moment he thought his eyes were playing tricks on him. Henry's fingers, until then as still as rest of his body, seemed to twitch ever so slightly. Ethan blinked rapidly, certain he was imagining things. The fatigue and pressure of the new job must be affecting his perception. Impossible. After so long in a vegetative state, it couldn't be, he muttered to himself, leaning in closer to be sure. Ethan's heart raced, a mixture of excitement and fear gripping him. He knew he should call Sophia immediately if there was any sign of change. But what if it was just his imagination? He couldn't afford to look incompetent or create false hope. "Mr. Blackwell," he called softly, his voice trembling with anticipation. "If you can hear me, if you can understand me, please try to move your fingers again." Ethan held his breath, his eyes fixed on Henry's hands, praying for a sign. Any sign. The seconds ticked by, feeling like an eternity. Ethan was about to convince himself he had indeed imagined it all when it happened. It wasn't just a twitch this time, but a definite movement. Henry's fingers contracted, slowly but unmistakably. Ethan felt his heart leap into his throat. "Oh my God," he whispered, adrenaline coursing through his veins. "He's responding. He's actually responding." The emotion was almost overwhelming, a mixture of joy, fear, and a staggering sense of responsibility. Without taking his eyes off Henry's hands, Ethan leaned in even closer, his face now mere inches from the patient. He wanted to be absolutely certain before alerting the family or doctors. "Mr. Blackwell, if you can hear me, please squeeze my hand," Ethan said, his voice a little louder this time, as he gently placed his hand in Henry's. What happened next was something Ethan would never forget. Henry's hand, moments ago lifeless, suddenly sprang to life. His fingers closed around Ethan's wrist with a startling, almost frightening strength. The shock was so great that Ethan nearly cried out. He instinctively tried to pull away, but Henry's grip was firm, almost desperate. The millionaire's eyes, until then closed and motionless, suddenly flew open, wide and filled with an intensity that made Ethan freeze in place. There was no doubt now. Henry Blackwell was awake, and more than that, he was trying to communicate something with a palpable urgency. Ethan felt a chill run down his spine, a mixture of fear and excitement. "Oh my God," he thought, his heart pounding so hard it felt like it might burst from his chest. What is happening here? Henry's grip was surprisingly strong for someone who had been in a coma for so long. Ethan felt panic rising in his chest as he struggled to break free. "Mr. Blackwell, please let me go," he pleaded, his voice trembling with fear and confusion. But Henry's eyes remained fixed on him, filled with a desperate urgency Ethan couldn't comprehend. The young nurse tried to remain calm, but his heart was racing erratically. What is he trying to tell me? Why does he look so terrified, gripping me so tightly, he thought, feeling sweat beading on his forehead. The seconds dragged like hours as Ethan continued in disbelief that Henry had not only responded, but also managed to control his movement. The millionaire's face was contorted in an expression that Ethan couldn't decipher. Was it pain, fear, or something else? Ethan tried to communicate with the patient again. "Mr. Blackwell, I'm here to help. If you can understand me, blink twice." He spoke with the firmest voice he could muster, but Henry merely continued to stare at him, his eyes wide and desperate. Suddenly, as abruptly as it had started, Henry's grip began to loosen. Ethan felt the older man's fingers gradually relax until his hand fell limp on the sheet. Henry's eyes closed slowly, and his face returned to the placid expression from before. "Mr. Blackwell," Ethan called softly, leaning closer. "Can you hear me? Please give any sign if you're listening to me." There was no response. Henry was again motionless, as if the last few minutes had never happened. Ethan stepped away from the bed, his legs trembling so much that he had to lean against the wall to avoid falling. His mind spun, trying to process what had just happened. Was that real, or am I losing my mind? He muttered to himself, running his hand through his now sweat-damp hair, taking deep breaths several times, trying to calm his heart that was still racing. With unsteady steps, he approached the monitors, his eyes frantically scanning the screens for any sign of change. But all the numbers and graphs remained unchanged, showing the same patterns as always. This doesn't make sense. How could he have had so much strength a moment ago and now? "Nothing," he muttered to himself, running his hand through his hair in frustration. Ethan's mind whirled with possibilities and doubts. He knew he needed to inform Sophia immediately, but a voice in his head warned him about the possible consequences. What if she doesn't believe me? What if she doesn't believe me and I lose this job? My mom needs the treatment. I can't risk everything for something that might have been my imagination or something that won't happen again, he thought, biting his lip nervously. He looked at Henry again, so serene and motionless on the bed. But what if it wasn't my imagination? What if he really did wake up for a moment? I can't ignore that. The internal conflict consumed him, leaving him paralyzed between professional duty and fear of consequences. Finally, after what seemed like an eternity, Ethan made his decision. With one last look at Henry, still motionless on the bed, he left the room in search of Sophia, his heart heavy with uncertainty over what he was about to do. The path to Sophia's office seemed endless. When he finally reached the office door, he hesitated, his hand hovering over the doorknob. It's now or never, he thought, gathering all his courage. He knocked softly and, after hearing a brief "come in," opened the door. Sophia was sitting behind an imposing desk, absorbed in a stack of documents. When Ethan entered, breathless and pale, she looked up with an evident expression of irritation. "What is it now, Mr. Parker? Did something happen? Is my father okay because you look so nervous?" she asked dryly, her voice laced with impatience. Ethan took a deep breath, trying to calm his nerves. His hands were trembling slightly, and he hid them in the pockets of his uniform. "Mrs. Blackwell," he began, his voice steadier than he expected. "Something happened with your father. He woke up for a moment. He grabbed my arm and opened his eyes. It was brief but real. I swear on my life." Sophia's reaction was immediate and cold. She slowly rose, circling the desk with measured steps, her eyes fixed on Ethan with an intensity that made him take a step back. The air in the office seemed to grow thicker, charged with tension. "You're telling me," she began, her voice dangerously calm, each word carefully pronounced, "that my father, who has been in a vegetative state for months, suddenly woke up, grabbed you, and then went back into a coma. All of this without any of the monitors registering any change?" she asked, making Ethan swallow hard, feeling the weight of her gaze. He could see the disbelief and anger growing in Sophia's eyes, but he knew he couldn't back down now. "I know it seems impossible, Mrs. Blackwell," he said, trying to keep his voice steady, "but it's the truth. I saw it with my own eyes. Your father, he seemed to be trying to tell me something." Sophia moved even closer, invading Ethan's personal space. He could smell her expensive perfume mixed with the scent of paper and ink from the office. "Mr. Parker," she said, her voice now laced with threat, "let me be very clear. If this is some kind of prank or attempt to get attention, you're messing with the wrong place. I will not tolerate false hopes or emotional manipulations in this house." She paused, her eyes boring into Ethan's. "We're going back to my father's room now, and if this is a fabrication of yours, consider yourself not only fired, but also sued for unethical conduct." "Understood?" she asked coldly, and Ethan nodded silently, feeling a knot form in his throat. The fear of losing his job and consequently the chance to help his mother weighed heavily on his chest. "God help me, because if she doesn't believe me, I'm lost," he thought, following Sophia out of the office. The path back to Henry's room seemed endless. Ethan could feel Sophia's gaze burning on his back, laden with skepticism and irritation. The silence between them was oppressive, broken only by the sound of their steps on the marble floor. Ethan tried to organize his thoughts, seeking a way to convince Sophia of what he had seen. What if it happens again while she's there? Maybe Mr. Blackwell can prove I'm telling the truth, he thought, a glimmer of hope arising. But another part of him feared that possibility. What if nothing happens? I'll be seen as a liar or worse, as someone trying to manipulate the family at such a delicate moment, he thought, terrified of that possibility. When they finally entered the room, Henry was exactly as Ethan had left him, motionless, pale, connected to the machines keeping him alive. The constant beep of monitors seemed to mock Ethan, as if they were saying, "See, nothing has changed." Sophia approached the bed, examining her father with critical eyes. She checked every monitor, every tube, looking for any sign of change. After a few moments of tense silence, she turned to Ethan, her piercing gaze like a blade. "Well, where is this miraculous change you saw?" "My father looks exactly as he has been for the last few months," she questioned, her tone icy. Ethan approached hesitantly, his eyes alternating between Henry and the monitors. He could feel beads of sweat forming on his forehead, and his hands were trembling slightly. I don't understand," he stammered, feeling the panic rise again. The reality of the situation hit him with full force. There was no proof of what he had experienced. He was awake, I swear he was. His eyes were open, he grabbed my arm. His voice faded, realizing how incredible his story sounded now. Sophia crossed her arms, her expression hardening even further. "Mr. Parker, I warned you about the importance of discretion and professionalism when I hired you. Making up stories and giving false hope is not only cruel, But also extremely unethical, she began, her voice laden with disappointment and restrained anger. Ethan's mind raced, trying to find an explanation that made sense. He couldn't have simply imagined it all, could he? Maybe it was an involuntary reflex, he suggested weakly, knowing how ridiculous it sounded even as the words left his mouth. Sometimes comatose patients can have reflex movements that seem intentional. He stopped speaking, realizing he was only digging himself deeper. Sophia let out an exasperated sigh, pinching the bridge of her nose as if trying to ward off an impending headache. Enough of these fantasies, Mr. Parker. I'm seriously beginning to question your competence for this job. She approached him, her voice lowering to a threatening tone that made Ethan instinctively recoil. Let me be clear. If you create any more problems or spread stories about non-existent miracles, your dismissal will be immediate. And believe me, I will make sure you never work as a nurse in this city again. Understood? Ethan nodded silently, feeling defeated and confused. Sophia's words weighed on him like a sentence. He watched as she made one final check of the equipment before leaving the room, shooting him a warning glance as she passed. When the door closed, Ethan turned to Henry, studying the older man's impassive face. I know what I saw, he murmured to himself, doubt seeping into his voice. I'm not going crazy, am I? The room's silence was his only answer, leaving Ethan with more questions than answers. He approached the bed, leaning over Henry. Mr. Blackwell, if you can hear me, please give me a sign. Anything. I need to know I'm not losing my mind, he whispered. But Henry remained motionless, his chest rising and falling in the mechanical rhythm imposed by the ventilator. The following hours passed in a blur of routines and checks, with Ethan constantly casting nervous glances at Henry, waiting for any sign of movement. But the millionaire remained motionless, as if the earlier incident had never occurred. Ethan performed his task mechanically, his mind still replaying the afternoon's events. He checked the vital signs, adjusted the medications, and performed basic care, all while struggling against the growing feeling that perhaps, just perhaps, he had imagined it all. As night fell, Ethan felt exhausted, both physically and emotionally. He sank into an armchair near Henry's bed, rubbing his tired eyes. Maybe I really did imagine it all. The stress of the new job, the worry about my mother. Maybe it's affecting my mind more than I realized, he thought, feeling the weight of the day on his shoulders. As he was organizing the medications for the night dose, moving silently around the room so as not to disturb the almost sacred silence that had settled, Ethan heard raised voices coming from the hallway. He stopped what he was doing, his body tense, alert. Recognizing Sophia's voice, he silently approached the door, his curiosity overriding his better judgment. The argument seemed heated, and Ethan soon identified the second voice as that of a man. He knew Mr. Blackwell had another son named Jackson, although Henry had never met him in person, but knew of his existence through the headlines that reported on the mansion's owner. You can't do this, Sophia. Dad deserves more time. We can't just give up on him as if he were a failed business. I don't want them to pull the plug. It's absurd for you to just decide to give up on him in a few more weeks. Give him more time, maybe. Maybe there's still a way out, Jackson shouted, his voice laden with emotion and a touch of despair that made Ethan involuntarily shrink. Ethan held his breath, his body as still as a statue. As he listened to the approaching footsteps echoing down the hallway, his heart pounded so fiercely that he feared the sound might betray his presence. The argument between Sophia and Jackson had ceased abruptly, and now the silence was broken only by the echo of footsteps growing ever nearer. The young nurse felt a bead of sweat trickle down his temple as his mind raced, trying to find a plausible explanation for his presence there. Ethan quickly considered his options. Should he pretend to be busy with some task, or face the situation head-on? Each second seemed to drag as he wrestled with indecision. Stay calm, Ethan. You haven't done anything wrong. You're just doing your job, he thought to himself. Before he could make a decision, the door opened with a soft creak, revealing Jackson Blackwell. The man stopped abruptly upon seeing Ethan, his red, swollen eyes widening in surprise. For a moment, the two stared at each other in silence, the tension palpable in the air. Ethan could feel his heart hammering against his ribs as he watched the emotions play across the man's face. Confusion, suspicion, and finally a guarded curiosity. "Who are you? What are you doing here? Were you spying on us?" Jackson asked, his voice hoarse, betraying his recent tears. His eyes raked over Ethan from top to bottom, as if trying to decipher a complex puzzle. Ethan felt a wave of empathy mixed with growing panic. "Blackwell's new nurse," he stammered, struggling to find the right words. His hands shook slightly as he clutched the clipboard, as if it were a shield against the unexpected situation. "I was just checking the medications for the nighttime dose." "You must be Mr. Jackson," Ethan paused, swallowing hard before continuing. "I didn't mean to interrupt. I should have announced myself. I'm sorry for the intrusion." He watched Jackson's face anxiously, trying to gauge his reaction. "Please don't fire me. I need this job. My mother is ill, and this is what I need to pay for her treatment. Please, sir, I didn't mean to spy on you," Ethan pleaded desperately. Jackson looked at Ethan for a long moment, as if assessing his sincerity. The silence between them was heavy, fraught with unresolved tension and unasked questions. Ethan could feel beads of sweat forming on his brow as he struggled to maintain an outward calm and professionalism. Then, surprisingly, Jackson's face softened, the suspicion in his eyes giving way to something else. Understanding, perhaps even a touch of hope. You heard our conversation, didn't you?" he asked, his voice low and laden with emotion. It wasn't an accusation, but rather a veiled plea for confirmation, as if Jackson was seeking an ally in his solitary struggle. Ethan hesitated, the weight of the decision bearing down on him. He knew the truth could cost him his job, but honesty was deeply ingrained in his nature. Moreover, Jackson's evident suffering struck a chord within him, reminding him of his own struggle to save his mother. With a resigned sigh, Ethan decided that the truth, risky as it might be, was the only path. "Yes, sir, I heard. Part of it," he admitted, his voice low but steady. "I'm sorry. It wasn't my intention to eavesdrop. I was just doing my job and I heard you." He paused, realizing further explanations might sound like hollow excuses. "No matter what happens now, at least I've maintained my integrity," Ethan thought. Jackson nodded slowly, processing Ethan's admission. For a moment, the hallway fell silent, the air heavy with the unspoken implications of the nurse's confession. Then, in a swift motion that caught Ethan off guard, Jackson grabbed his arm and pulled him into a more secluded corner of the hallway. The urgency of the gesture was palpable, and Ethan found himself dragged away from the bright lights of the main corridor into the shadows of a nearby alcove. "I need your help, Ethan," Jackson whispered, his voice trembling with a mixture of desperation and determination. "My father, he can't die like this. Sophia, she wants... Well, I can't even complete the sentence. We can't let her make such a drastic decision alone. I know you took an oath as a nurse, so help me. Fight for him." His eyes sought Ethan's, pleading for understanding and support. Ethan felt the weight of the situation settle on his shoulders like a ton of bricks. He knew he was about to be dragged into the midst of a family conflict that could very well cost him his job and the chance to help his own mother. The ethical dilemma consumed him from within. On one hand, his professional duty demanded neutrality and discretion. On the other, his conscience screamed that he couldn't stand idly by while a life was potentially at stake. The anguish in Jackson's eyes was palpable, a reflection of Ethan's own fear of losing a loved one. "Mr. Jackson," Ethan began, choosing his words carefully, "I understand your concern, and I will always honor my oath. But I don't know how I can help. I'm just a nurse and a new one here. My influence is limited, and I also have a lot to lose." He hesitated, thinking of his mother, of his own struggles. Jackson squeezed Ethan's arm harder, his eyes shining with a mixture of desperation and determination that made the young nurse swallow hard. "You're the only person who will spend enough time with my father to notice any change. I need you to be alert to any sign, no matter how small, that he's still in there." An eye movement, a hand squeeze. "Anything," Jackson insisted, his voice an urgent whisper, then paused, taking a deep breath before continuing. "I know I'm asking a lot, but think about it. What if it was your father in that bed? Wouldn't you do everything in your power to save him? Jackson's words hit Ethan like a punch in the gut. He felt his stomach twist with the irony of the situation. Just hours earlier, he had witnessed exactly the kind of sign Jackson was begging him to look for. The memory of Henry grabbing his arm, his eyes open and desperate, was still vivid in his mind. But revealing the incident now, after Sophia had so vehemently discredited him, seemed an enormous risk. Ethan found himself torn between his professional duty, his desire to help, and his very real fear of losing everything. Mr. Jackson, I promise I'm always alert to your father's condition. It's my duty as a nurse to observe and report any changes. But I need you to understand that my position here is delicate. Your sister made it very clear that, Ethan began, choosing his words carefully. Jackson interrupted him, his voice now an urgent whisper that barely contained his emotion. Forget Sophia for a moment. What do you think, honestly? Is there any chance of my father recovering? He pleaded, his eyes fixed on Ethan's, with an almost painful intensity. The question hung in the air between them, heavy with hope and fear. Ethan could feel the weight of Jackson's expectations, the desperation of a son fighting to save his father. It was a feeling he knew all too well, an echo of his own struggle to save his mother. Ethan closed his eyes for a moment, battling internally. His professional duty told him to be cautious, not to feed false hopes, but the image of Henry reacting, however briefly, wouldn't leave him. He knew that moment could be crucial, not only for Henry and his family, but for his own future as well. With a deep sigh, Ethan opened his eyes, meeting Jackson's gaze with a mixture of compassion and determination. I can't make any promises. Medicine doesn't always have definite answers. But I saw something today, something I can't fully explain. He paused, weighing each word, his voice low but firm. Jackson's eyes widened, a flame of hope kindling in them so bright it almost hurt to look. What? What did you see? Tell me, please. I need to know everything if there's any chance of saving him. I need you to tell me. What happened? He asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Then Jackson grabbed Ethan's shoulders, shaking him gently in his urgency. The intensity of his reaction caught Ethan off guard, reminding him of how much was at stake in this conversation. He opened his mouth to respond, to share what he had witnessed, feeling that maybe, just maybe, this could be the chance to make the difference he had always dreamed of as a nurse. But before Ethan could form the words, Sophia's cutting voice echoed down the hallway, cold and sharp as a blade. What's going on here? She approached rapidly, her high heels clacking on the marble floor like gunshots. The sound seemed to mark the countdown to the end of Ethan's career, each click a second closer to disaster. Her eyes sparked with anger as she looked from Jackson to Ethan, her face a mask of controlled fury. I should have known you'd try to influence the nurse, Jackson, she spat, before turning her attention to Ethan. And you, Mr. Parker, I thought we'd made the limits of your position here clear. Ethan felt the blood drain from his face, icy fear spreading through his veins. He tried to pull away from Jackson, but the other man still gripped him tightly, as if Ethan was his last hope. Sophia, please. Jackson began, his voice pleading for understanding, but his sister cut him off with a brusque gesture, her eyes never leaving Ethan's pale face. The young nurse could feel his dream of helping his mother slipping through his fingers, disappearing as quickly as it had surfaced. Enough, Jackson, Sophia said, her voice laced with a finality that made Ethan shudder. We've discussed this. Your intrusion into family matters and clear breach of confidentiality are unacceptable, she continued, each word carefully enunciated, hitting Ethan like a punch to the gut, leaving him breathless. He felt the panic rising, threatening to engulf him completely. Mrs. Blackwell, please. I didn't mean to intrude. I was just doing my job, please. I need this job. My mother, Ethan pleaded, his trembling voice betraying his desperation. He stopped abruptly, realizing he was about to reveal personal information that might do nothing to improve his situation. The fear of losing everything he had worked so hard for consumed him, but he forced himself to remain steady, meeting Sophia's gaze. Give me a chance to explain. I promise there won't be any more misunderstandings. The silence that followed seemed endless. Ethan could hear his own heart pounding, the deafening sound in his ears. Jackson was still holding his arm, as if fearing that Ethan might disappear if he let go. The tension in the air was palpable, charged with unspoken emotions and decisions that could change lives. Sophia opened her mouth to speak, her face a mask of unyielding determination. Ethan braced himself for the final blow, his mind already racing to think of how he might possibly help his mother now. But before Sophia could utter the words that would seal Ethan's fate, a shrill, terrified scream echoed through the apartment, cutting the air like a knife. The sound was so unexpected and laced with dread that everyone froze instantly, their faces turning in the direction it came from. "It came from Dad's room," Jackson whispered, his face suddenly pale as paper. Ethan recognized the voice immediately. It was the assistant nurse who had arrived for the night shift, his stomach twisted with a mixture of fear and adrenaline. What could have caused such an extreme reaction? Without a second thought, acting purely on instinct and training, Ethan broke free from Jackson's grip and began running toward the room. Ethan burst into the room, his eyes quickly assessing the chaotic situation before him. Henry Blackwell, previously motionless for months, was now in the midst of a violent seizure. His body was convulsing on the bed, muscles tightened in uncontrollable spasms. The assistant nurse was paralyzed with fear, her hands trembling as she tried uselessly to hold Henry down. The monitors were blaring shrill alarms, their displays flashing in urgent red. Without hesitation, Ethan took control of the situation. "Stand back! I need space to work!" he shouted, gently pushing the assistant nurse aside. His thoughts raced as he approached the bed. "Stay calm, Ethan. You've trained for this. Every second counts." With swift, precise movements, Ethan began performing emergency procedures. He rolled Henry onto his side, protecting his head to prevent injury. "You, get me the emergency kit and 10 milliliters of diazepam now." He pointed at the assistant nurse, his voice firm and authoritative. The nurse, still trembling but grateful for clear instructions, rushed to comply. Sophia and Jackson had arrived at the doorway, their faces pale with shock. "What's happening? Why is my father like this?" Sophia demanded, her voice betraying the fear she felt. Ethan answered without taking his eyes off Henry. "Severe seizure. Please stand back and let me work." The nurse returned with the kit and medication. Ethan administered the diazepam swiftly, his movements fluid and assured. "Monitor his vitals and report any changes to me," he instructed the nurse, who now seemed more composed. He continued working tirelessly, checking Henry's airways, adjusting his body position, ever watchful for any sign of improvement or deterioration. The minutes seemed to drag on, each second marked by the frantic beeps of the monitors and Jackson's muffled sobs in the background. Ethan felt beads of sweat trickling down his forehead, but he dared not take his hands off Henry to wipe them away. "Come on, Mr. Blackwell, stay with me." "You're stronger than this," he murmured softly. Gradually, the convulsions began to subside. Henry's breathing, once erratic and shallow, started to stabilize. Ethan felt a wave of relief course through his body, but he maintained his focus. "His vitals are normalizing," the nurse reported, her voice now steadier. Ethan nodded, allowing himself a small smile. "Good work," he told her. "Keep monitoring him closely." He turned to Sophia and Jackson, who were watching the scene with a mixture of fear and hope. "He's stabilizing, but we need to call a doctor immediately." Minutes later, Samuel Green rushed into the room, his white coat billowing behind him. "What happened?" "I received an emergency call from Mrs. Sophia. Can you brief me on what happened with the patient?" he asked, already moving to examine Henry. Ethan stepped aside, allowing the doctor full access to the patient. He quickly recounted the events, his voice professional and concise. "Generalized seizure, approximately 5 minutes in duration, administered 10 milligrams of diazepam, and performed standard emergency procedures." Samuel Green listened attentively, his skilled hands examining Henry as Ethan spoke. After a few minutes of thorough examination, Samuel Green straightened up, a pensive look on his face. He turned to Ethan, an expression of in his eyes. "Excellent work, Mr. Parker. Your swift and precise actions likely saved Mr. Blackwell's life." Ethan felt a surge of pride and relief course through his body. He had done his job and done it well. The doctor turned to Sophia and Jackson, who were anxiously awaiting news. "Your father's condition is stable now. but we'll need to run further tests to understand what triggered this seizure. It could be a sign of increased brain activity, but I don't want to raise false hopes." Sophia, who until then had maintained an impassive expression, finally let her mask of control slip. She approached Ethan, her eyes a complex mix of emotions. "Mr. Parker," she began, her voice trembling slightly. I owe you an apology. Your actions today went above and beyond what we could have expected." She paused as if struggling internally. "You may continue working here, but understand that you will still be under close observation. I don't want any more intrusions into our personal lives," she stated, and Ethan nodded, feeling an enormous weight lifted off his shoulders. "Thank you, Mrs. Blackwell. I promise I won't let you down." The following hours passed in a blur of activity. Tests were performed, medications adjusted, and constant vigilance was maintained over Henry. Ethan worked tirelessly, assisting Samuel Green and ensuring that Henry remained stable. The room, once an oasis of calm, was now a hub of frantic activity. Nurses came and went, bringing equipment and test results. Ethan coordinated everything with an efficiency that surprised even himself. "So we need another scan," he demanded, his mind focused, processing every new piece of information and adjusting the care plan as needed. When he finally had a moment to breathe, Ethan found himself alone in the room with Henry. The silence was a welcome change after the previous chaos. He allowed himself to drop into a chair near the bed, exhausted but vigilant. "That was a close one, Mr. Blackwell. But you're a fighter, aren't you?" he murmured, observing the now serene face of the patient. Ethan rubbed his tired eyes, feeling the weight of the day's events. His mind drifted to his mother, reminding him of the reason he couldn't give up, no matter how difficult things became. "We both have people to fight for, Mr. Blackwell. Your children seem to love you very much, each in their own way. Let's not disappoint those who love us," he said softly. As he straightened the room, trying to restore some order after the confusion of the emergency, Ethan came across something unexpected. Hidden among some papers in a drawer, there was an old photo album. Intrigued, he picked it up, feeling the weight of the memories contained within its pages. The leather cover was worn, but still elegant, with the name Blackwell embossed in gold letters. Perhaps this could help, he thought, remembering having read about the benefits of familiar stimuli for comatose patients. He approached Henry's bedside, carefully opening the album. "Mr. Blackwell, I found some old photos. Would you like me to describe them to you?" he said softly. Ethan began slowly flipping through the album, describing each photo to Henry. There were images of a young, happy family, Henry much younger, with Sophia and Jackson as children, holiday snaps, birthdays, everyday moments frozen in time. "Look, Mr. Blackwell, this must be from Sophia's first birthday," Ethan commented, describing a photo of a smiling baby with cake on her face. "And here is that you teaching Jackson to ride a bike." As he spoke, Ethan watched Henry's face intently, searching for any sign of reaction. That's when it happened, so subtle it was almost missed. Henry's eyes moved following the images Ethan was showing. Ethan's heart leapt. "Mr. Blackwell, can you hear me? Can you see the photos?" he called, leaning in closer. Excited by the possibility of a breakthrough, Ethan decided to call Jackson. He knew he was risking a lot, especially after Sophia's warning, but he felt it was the right thing to do. His hands trembled slightly as he picked up the phone. "Stay calm, Ethan. This could be important. But try not to give false hope," he murmured to himself. Quickly, he sent Jackson a message, asking him to come to the room immediately. As he waited, he continued showing Henry the photos, his heart racing with the hope that perhaps, just maybe, they were witnessing the beginning of a miracle. "Come on, Mr. Blackwell. Show us you're still in there. Your family needs this sign," he whispered encouragingly. Jackson arrived within minutes, his face a mixture of anxiety and hope. He rushed into the room, his eyes darting between Ethan and his father. "What is it, Ethan? Has something happened? Has there been a change since we left?" he asked, his voice thick with emotion, a blend of fear and anticipation. Ethan nodded, trying to contain his excitement so as not to raise expectations too high. "I believe so, Mr. Blackwell. Your father. I think he's responding to the photos. Look." He started showing the images again, narrating each one as he had before. His eyes flicked between the album and Henry's face, anxiously awaiting a repeat of the movement he had witnessed moments earlier. But to his despair and confusion, Henry remained utterly motionless. There was no eye movement, no sign of the reaction Ethan was certain he had seen just moments ago. The room seemed to have grown quieter, the tension palpable in the air. Ethan continued displaying the photos, his voice growing increasingly anxious as he turned the pages. "Look, Mr. Blackwell, here you are at Sophia's wedding. Do you remember that day?" But Henry remained impassive, his face a mask of serenity that now seemed to mock Ethan's hopes. Jackson watched for a few minutes, his initially hopeful expression morphing into one of disappointment. The light of hope in his eyes gradually dimmed, replaced by a deep sadness that Ethan could almost feel physically. Finally, Jackson placed a hand on Ethan's shoulder, gently interrupting his frantic narration. He turned to the nurse, his eyes a complex blend of emotions, sadness, frustration, and what hurt Ethan the most, a flicker of suspicion. "Ethan, I understand you want to help, but are you sure about what you saw?" "There doesn't seem to be any reaction now," Jackson said, his voice weary and defeated. Ethan felt his stomach sink. The disappointment on Jackson's face was like a weight on his chest. He knew what he had seen, but how could he prove it? How could he convince Jackson when the evidence had vanished as mysteriously as it had appeared? "I swear, Mr. Blackwell," he was responding, "I wouldn't make something like that up." "Please believe me," he said, his voice thick with desperate conviction. Ethan could feel Jackson's gaze upon him, assessing, weighing. The silence in the room was oppressive, broken only by the steady beep of the monitors, a cruel reminder of Henry's unchanging condition. In the days that followed, Ethan plunged into an almost obsessive mission to prove that Henry Blackwell was still present, trapped within his own body. Every free minute was dedicated to stimulating any kind of response from the patient. The hours dragged on while Ethan spoke incessantly, describing the weather outside, the latest news, even narrating soccer games that he discovered the millionaire's son that Henry adored. His hands, already calloused from constant work, flipped through family albums repeatedly, hoping to provoke that subtle eye movement he had witnessed before. "Come on, Mr. Blackwell. I know you're in there." "Show us again," Ethan murmured, his voice hoarse from so much talking. As the days passed, Ethan expanded his arsenal of stimuli. He brought a small portable radio and began playing Henry's songs, which he had asked Jackson about, filling the room with the soft chords of classic jazz. He watched closely for any change in heart rate, any fluctuation in the monitors, desperately searching for any sign of response. But Henry remained stubbornly motionless, his eyes closed, his face a serene mask that seemed to mock Ethan's frantic efforts. The young nurse felt frustration growing within him, mixed with a fierce determination. "I won't give up on you, even if it's the last thing I do in this job," he promised in a low voice, gently adjusting Henry's pillow. The tension in the apartment was palpable, growing with each passing day. The fateful deadline for turning off the machines loomed like a storm on the horizon, casting a shadow over all the inhabitants of the penthouse. Sophia became increasingly irritable, her presence in her father's room marked by cold looks and cutting words. Ethan could feel the weight of her scrutiny every time he entered the room. "Mr. Parker, I hope you're not feeding my brother false hopes," she would say, her voice sharp as a razor. Ethan swallowed hard, forcing a professional smile. "Just doing my job, Mrs. Blackwell. Nothing more, nothing less." Jackson, on the other hand, was an emotional roller coaster. There were moments when he would enter the room beaming, convinced that he had seen a movement, a blink, anything that could indicate his father was coming back. "Ethan, did you see that? I'm sure he moved his finger," he would exclaim, his eyes shining with an almost painful hope. But those moments were invariably followed by periods of deep despair, where Jackson would sit silently beside the bed, holding his father's inert hand, silent tears streaming down his face. Ethan watched these oscillations with a heavy heart, knowing all too well what it was like to cling to every shred of hope when a loved one was ill. As the deadline approached, Ethan made a drastic decision. He knew he was risking his job, perhaps even his career, but he couldn't bear the thought of missing any opportunity to witness a sign of consciousness in Henry. Against Sophia's express orders, he decided to spend the night in the room. There's just an extra precaution. I want to make sure we're closely monitoring any changes over the next 24 hours, he thought. Night fell over the city, the incandescent lights twinkling outside like earthly stars. Ethan settled into an armchair beside Henry's bed, determined to remain awake and vigilant. The hours dragged on, marked only by the rhythmic beeping of the monitors and Henry's artificial breathing. Ethan fought against sleep, his eyes burning with the effort to stay open. He spoke softly to Henry, sharing stories from his own life, about his sick mother, his dreams and fears. You know, Mr. Blackwell, sometimes I wonder if I'm doing the right thing, if I'm not just prolonging the inevitable. But then I remember my mother, how I would do anything to save her, and I know I have to keep trying. For you, for your family, he murmured, his voice thick with fatigue. At some point in the early morning hours, Ethan must have dozed off. He woke with a start, disoriented for a moment. Something had woken him, a sound so faint it was barely perceptible. Blinking away the sleep, Ethan leaned forward, his eyes adjusting to the dimness of the room. That's when he saw something that made his heart stop for an instant. Tears, silent tears, were streaming down Henry Blackwell's face. Ethan held his breath, barely daring to believe what he was seeing. Mr. Blackwell, can you hear me? He called softly, his voice trembling with emotion. With shaking hands, Ethan reached for his cell phone in the pocket of his uniform. He needed to document this, needed proof. His heart was pounding frantically as he tried to turn on the device, but nothing happened. The screen remained stubbornly dark. No, 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 he muttered desperately, repeatedly pressing the power button. But it was no use. The battery was completely dead. Ethan felt a mix of frustration and despair consume him. Here was the proof he had been seeking, and he had no way to record it. Damn it, this has to work. If I can't prove this, he's going to. No, don't think about it, Ethan whispered to himself, fighting the urge to hurl the phone against the wall. Forcing himself to calm down, Ethan turned his attention back to Henry. The tears continued to fall, a silent testimony to a consciousness that everyone believed had been lost. Gently, Ethan took a tissue and wiped Henry's face, his touch soft and respectful. It's okay, Mr. Blackwell. I'm here. I won't leave you alone, he said softly, his voice laden with emotion. He held Henry's hand, feeling a connection that went beyond words. We're going to show them you're still in there. Together, we're going to fight for your life. Time seemed to have stopped in that room. Ethan remained by Henry's side, observing every movement, every breath with an almost painful intensity. He spoke softly, words of encouragement and comfort flowing from his lips in a steady stream. You're stronger than this, Mr. Blackwell. I know you can hear. I know you're fighting to come back to your family. Don't give up now. Henry's tears eventually ceased, but Ethan remained vigilant, afraid to miss any other sign of consciousness. As the first rays of sunlight began to seep through the cracks in the curtains, Ethan felt the weight of the night on his shoulders. He was exhausted, physically and emotionally drained, but also filled with a renewed determination. Now he knew without a shadow of a doubt that Henry was still present. The challenge now was to convince the others, especially Sophia. Ethan knew that without concrete proof, his words could easily be dismissed as the ramblings of an exhausted and emotionally invested nurse. How can I make them believe? There has to be a way, he muttered to himself, running his hand through his hair in frustration. Lost in his thoughts, Ethan almost didn't hear the soft click of the doorknob turning. His heart leapt into his throat when he saw the bedroom door slowly opening. For a moment of panic, he considered pretending to be asleep, but knew that would only make things worse if he was caught. So he straightened up in his chair, bracing himself for whatever might come next. The door opened fully, revealing the unmistakable silhouette of Sophia Blackwell. Ethan felt his blood run cold. What was she doing there so early? And more importantly, what would she do upon finding him there, clearly having disobeyed her orders? Sophia entered the room, her eyes adjusting to the darkness. When her gaze fell upon Ethan, sitting by her father's bedside, A mixture of emotions flashed across her face. Surprise, irritation, and something else Ethan couldn't quite decipher. For a tense moment, no one spoke. The silence was broken only by the steady beep of monitors and Henry's artificial breathing. Finally, Sophia took a step forward, her voice low but cutting through the stillness of the room. "Mr. Parker, just what do you think you're doing here?" Ethan swallowed hard, his mind racing to find the right words. He knew this moment could define everything: his job, Henry's future, perhaps even his own career. "Mrs. Blackwell, I know this looks irregular, but something happened tonight that you need to know about," he began, forcing his voice to remain steady. He paused, gathering courage before continuing. "Your father," he cried, real tears. "I saw it with my own eyes." Ethan watched Sophia's face, searching for any sign that she believed him. "Please," he thought desperately, "please believe me." Sophia's expression was difficult to read. She took a few more steps into the room, her eyes alternating between Ethan and her father's serene face. Tears. "Mr. Parker, I understand you want to help, but," she repeated, her voice a mixture of skepticism and what might have been hope. She stopped, seeming to struggle with her own emotions. Ethan saw an opportunity and seized it with both hands. "I know how it sounds, but I swear on my life it's true. I tried to record it, but my phone was dead. Mrs. Blackwell, I know I don't have concrete proof, but I beg you to consider the possibility. What if your father is still in there fighting to communicate?" he said quickly, rising from his chair. The silence that followed seemed endless. Ethan could hear his own heart pounding frantically, the deafening sound in his ears. Sophia remained still, her gaze fixed on Henry. When she finally spoke, her voice was almost a whisper. "Do you have any idea what you're doing, Mr. Parker? Hope? It can be cruel." She turned to face him, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. "If this is just your imagination, or worse, some kind of manipulation so you don't lose your job." Ethan felt a knot form in his throat. He took a step towards Sophia, his voice laden with sincerity. "I understand your fear, Mrs. Blackwell, but what if it's true? What if your father really is trying to come back to us? We can't give up on him now." At that moment, as if answering Ethan's words, a soft sound filled the room. It was barely perceptible at first, but soon became clear to both of them. Henry Blackwell was softly groaning, a sound neither of them had heard in months. Ethan and Sophia froze, their eyes wide with shock and renewed hope. The groan grew slightly louder, unmistakable now. Ethan moved quickly to the bedside, his voice trembling with emotion. "Mr. Blackwell, can you hear us?" Sophia joined him, her hands gripping the bed rails tightly. "Dad! Dad, we're here!" she called, her voice choked. Henry's eyes remained closed, but his lips moved slightly as if trying to form words. Ethan and Sophia exchanged a look of amazement and renewed hope. The impossible was happening before their very eyes. Henry Blackwell, the man everyone thought was lost forever, was giving undeniable signs of consciousness. Ethan felt a wave of emotion wash over him, a mixture of relief, joy, and an overwhelming sense of purpose. He had believed when everyone else had given up, and now everything was about to change. "Call Doubter Green." "I think we just witnessed the start of a miracle," he told Sophia, his voice firm and resolute. Doubter Green arrived at Henry's room with surprising swiftness, his face a mixture of professional skepticism and barely concealed curiosity. Ethan watched anxiously as the doctor performed a series of tests, his heart pounding with a mixture of hope and fear. The cold stethoscope slid over Henry's chest. Bright lights were shone into his eyes, and verbal commands were given in varying tones. Each second felt like an eternity to Ethan, who alternated his gaze between Henry's impassive face and Doubter Green's concentrated expression. The tension in the room was palpable, the silence broken only by the constant beeps of the monitors and the occasional murmurs from the doctor. "Please, show us something. Anything, Mr. Blackwell. Prove you're still in there," Ethan thought desperately, his hands clenched into fists by his sides. After what seemed an eternity, Doubter Green stepped back from the bed, his face now a carefully constructed mask of professionalism. Ethan felt his heart sink as he saw the doctor's expression, recognizing the subtle signs of disappointment and resignation. The young nurse fought the urge to intervene, to insist that the doctor look again, to search deeper. But he knew his place was to remain silent, awaiting the verdict that could change everything. "Mrs. Blackwell, Mr. Parker, I found no concrete signs of consciousness in Mr. Blackwell. The movements and sounds you witnessed are likely involuntary reflexes, common in patients in a vegetative state," began Doubter Green, his voice measured and controlled, echoing in the silent room. The doctor paused, letting the words sink in, his eyes moving between Ethan and Sophia, assessing their reactions. "I understand the desire to see progress, but we must be realistic about Mr. Blackwell's condition." Ethan felt like the ground had disappeared from beneath his feet, an abyss of despair opening in his chest. He opened his mouth to protest, to insist that what they had witnessed was more than mere reflexes. But the words died in his throat as he saw the expression on Sophia's face. She had transformed before his eyes, the momentary hope giving way to a calculated coldness that made Ethan shudder. It was as if a curtain had fallen, hiding any trace of emotion behind a facade of business efficiency. "I understand, doctor. In that case, I believe there is no longer any reason to prolong this." "The machines will be turned off as soon as possible," said Sophia, her voice cutting through the air like a blade of ice. The words hung in the air, heavy and final, like a death sentence. Ethan felt panic rising in his chest, a wave of nausea threatening to overwhelm him. "No, it can't end like this. Not after everything we've seen," he thought desperately, his hands gripping Henry's bedrail, as if he could anchor the man to life by force of will alone. "Mrs. Blackwell, please, you can't make such a drastic decision now. What I saw tonight, the tears, that has to mean something." "We need more time, more tests," Ethan interjected, his voice trembling with emotion, the words tumbling out in a rush of desperation. He looked pleadingly at Doubter Green, seeking support, but the doctor only averted his gaze, clearly uncomfortable with the situation. But before Ethan could continue his appeal, Sophia cut him off abruptly, whirling on her heels to face him. Her eyes flashed with anger, a contained storm about to erupt. "Enough, Mr. Parker. Your obsession with my father's condition has gone too far. You're delusional, and worse, you're influencing me with your fantasies," she hissed, each word laced with venom. She took a step towards him, invading his personal space, her voice low and threatening. "From now on, you are forbidden from entering this room without supervision. You will only come in to do your job, supervised by someone else. If I hear one more word about miracles or signs, I won't hesitate to call security. Are we clear?" Ethan felt as if he'd been punched in the gut, the air escaping his lungs. He stumbled back, his back hitting the cold wall of the room. The reality of the situation hit him with full force. He was alone in his belief, seen as a madman clinging to false hope. He looked to Doubter Green again, seeking any support, any sign of doubt or hesitation he could use in his favor. But the doctor only averted his gaze, clearly uncomfortable with the situation, his silence as damning as Sophia's cutting words. With a brief nod, the doctor withdrew, his footsteps echoing down the hallway, leaving Ethan alone to face Sophia's fury. The young nurse felt the weight of defeat on his shoulders, but something inside him refused to give up. "Mrs. Blackwell, I swear I'm not making anything up. Please give your father more time. He deserves that chance." Ethan tried once more, his voice almost a whisper, laden with pleading. But Sophia had already turned away, her rigid posture an impenetrable barrier. She left the room without looking back, the sound of her heels on the marble floor like hammers into the coffin of Ethan's hopes. For several minutes, Ethan remained motionless, leaning against the wall trying to process what had happened. The room, once a battlefield of emotions and arguments, now seemed strangely empty and silent. The constant beeping of the monitors seemed to mock him, a cruel reminder of how close and yet so far he was from proving that Henry was still present. Slowly, as if moved by a force beyond his conscious will, Ethan approached the bed. His eyes traced Henry's serene face, desperately searching for any sign, however small, of the awareness he was sure he had witnessed. I won't let them give up on you and unplug the machines. I might lose my job, but I won't give up on what's right to do, Ethan muttered, his determination growing again, fueled by the injustice of the situation. With hurried steps and a heavy heart, Ethan left the room in search of Jackson. His mind raced, trying to formulate a plan, a strategy, anything that could reverse the seemingly hopeless situation. He found Henry's younger son in the office, an elegant but oppressive room filled with reminders of the empire Henry had built. Jackson was leaning over a pile of documents, his face a mask of exhaustion and worry that seemed to have aged years in just a few days. When Ethan entered, Jackson looked up, a spark of hope briefly shining in his eyes before quickly being replaced by resignation, as if he already expected bad news. "Ethan, what happened?" I heard raised voices. Sophia sounded furious, he said, his voice tired and hoarse, betraying sleepless nights and days of constant worry. Ethan approached the desk, his words pouring out in a desperate torrent, as if fearing that if he stopped speaking, the reality of the situation would crush him completely. He told about the tears he had witnessed during the night, the moans he and Sophia had heard, Deuter Green's skeptical reaction, and Sophia's cold, calculated decision. His hands gesticulated frantically as he spoke, his eyes pleading with Jackson to believe him, to see the truth behind his words. "Jackson, I swear on my life, your father is in there. He's trying to communicate, trying to come back to us. We need more time. We can't let him go like this. Not when there's a chance, however small." Jackson listened in silence, his face a complex mixture of emotions, hope, fear, doubt, and a deep, overwhelming sadness. When Ethan finished, he let out a deep sigh, the sound carrying the weight of all the lost battles and frustrated hopes of the past months. Running his hand through his hair in a gesture of frustration that was so reminiscent of his father that Ethan felt a pang in his chest, Jackson finally spoke. "Ethan, I want to believe you. More than anything in the world, I want to believe my father is still with us. But I'm losing hope every day that passes, every negative test. It's like losing my father all over again. It's like watching him die a little more with each hour," he explained, visibly struggling with the words as if each one was a betrayal of everything he wanted to believe. Ethan felt his heart ache with the evident pain in Jackson's voice. He knew that feeling well, the despair of watching someone you love slowly slip away, powerless to stop it. It was like reliving his own mother's illness, that suffocating feeling that no matter how hard you try, it's not enough. "Can't we stop, Sophia?" "There must be some legal process we can start to buy more time," Ethan asked, grasping at any possibility, however remote. Jackson shook his head sadly, his eyes fixed on a family photo on the desk. Henry, younger and full of life, his arms around a young Sophia and Jackson. "She has the medical power of attorney. Dad." He trusted her judgment. "Legally, there's nothing we can do." "The decision is hers," he said, the words coming out like a painful confession. The revelation hit Ethan like a bucket of cold water, extinguishing the last embers of hope he was trying to keep alive. He stepped away from the desk, unable to remain still, his mind racing for a solution, anything that could change the course of events that seemed to be unfolding inexorably toward a tragic end. He couldn't let things end like this, not when he was so certain that Henry was still present, fighting to come back. It was madness, of course, but at this point, what choice did he have? Ethan fell silent for a moment, his mind churning with possibilities and risks. The conversation with Jackson had only confirmed his suspicions. Legally, there was nothing they could do to stop Sophia, but Ethan couldn't accept that, not when he was so certain that Henry was still present, struggling to communicate. An idea began to form in his mind, risky and potentially disastrous for his career, but perhaps their only chance. Ethan knew he couldn't involve Jackson or anyone else. This would have to be something he did alone, risking everything. The plan was daring: use his lunch break to take Henry to a nearby clinic, have a more detailed brain activity scan performed, something that could pick up signals the tests at the apartment might have missed. It was risky, potentially illegal even, but it could be their only chance to prove Henry was still there, fighting to communicate. Ethan carefully weighed the pros and cons in his mind. If he were caught, he would lose his job, his license, everything he had worked so hard for. His career as a nurse would be over. But when he thought of the alternative, of Henry being unplugged, of all the lost possibilities, he knew he had no choice. It's the right thing to do. If there's even a chance, however small, I have no right to ignore it, Ethan muttered to himself, his determination growing. As he mentally worked out the details of the plan, Ethan felt a mixture of adrenaline and fear coursing through his veins. He would use his authority as a nurse to arrange the transport, claiming the need for routine exams that couldn't be performed in the apartment. It would have to be fast, discreet, and above all, well executed. There would be no margin for error. It was a plan fraught with potential pitfalls, but it was all he had. As he finalized the details in his mind, Ethan felt the weight of responsibility on his shoulders. It was like standing on the edge of a cliff, knowing that the next step could mean salvation or destruction. This has to work. It's Henry's last chance, and I'll do it alone no matter the cost, he thought to himself, determination hardening his resolve. Hours later, with everything carefully planned, Ethan's heart was pounding in anticipation of what he was about to do. He entered Henry's room, quickly checking his vitals and ensuring everything was stable. With careful movements, he began preparing Henry for transport, disconnecting non-essential monitors and organizing the necessary portable equipment. As he worked, Ethan couldn't help but speak softly to Henry. "Come on, Mr. Blackwell. I know you're in there. Today's the day we're going to prove it to everyone. If anyone comes to unplug you today, they won't find you here. If I have to, I'll take you to my house, anywhere until you get a chance." His hands trembled slightly as he adjusted the tubes and checked the connections. The magnitude of what he was about to do hit him full force. If he were caught, it wouldn't just be his job at risk, but his entire career. With Henry ready for transport, Ethan took one last look around the room, ensuring he hadn't left any evidence of his plans behind. He checked his watch just a few minutes until his official lunch break. The timing was crucial. It was at that moment that Ethan heard it, the soft but unmistakable sound of the private elevator rising. His heart seemed to stop for an instant. No one should be arriving now. Sophia had warned that they would unplug as soon as possible after the diagnosis, so the sound of the elevator seemed to mark the end of the countdown to what could be the end of everything Ethan had planned. Ethan felt his body freeze, panic rising in his chest like a cold wave. His eyes frantically scanned the room, searching for any evidence of his plans he might have left in plain sight. The transport cart, the equipment bags, it all needed to be hidden and fast. With frantic movements, he began pushing the cart towards the room's spacious closet, his heart pounding so hard he thought it might burst at any moment. Come on, it can't end like this. Not now, he muttered to himself, adrenaline coursing through his veins. As he struggled to hide the evidence, Ethan heard voices approaching down the hallway. He immediately recognized Sophia's authoritative tone, accompanied by other voices he didn't know. His stomach sank as he realized what was happening. Sophia had brought the team to unplug. It wasn't just his plan in jeopardy now. It was Henry's life itself. With one last desperate shove, Ethan managed to close the closet door, sealing away all his hopes of saving Henry. Taking a deep breath, he forced himself to recompose, assuming his usual professional demeanor. Stay calm, act naturally, as if nothing is wrong, he thought, adjusting his uniform. The door to the room opened, revealing Sophia at the head of a small group of medical professionals. Her eyes swept the room, finally landing on Ethan with a mixture of surprise and suspicion. "Mr. Parker, I didn't expect to find you here." "I thought you said you'd only be here under supervision," she said, her voice as cold as ice. Ethan swallowed hard, forcing a professional smile. "There was no need, ma'am. I was just performing the routine care, Mrs. Blackwell. Is there anything I can do to assist?" He responded, silently thanking himself for his voice not wavering. Sophia studied him for a moment, as if trying to read his thoughts. Finally, she nodded briefly. "We're here to finalize things," she said, her voice lowering slightly. "The family would like a moment alone with my father before we proceed." Ethan felt his heart clench at those words. It was real. It was really happening. He nodded mechanically, moving to leave the room. As he passed Sophia, she grabbed his arm, her voice a sharp whisper. "And Mr. Parker, don't even think about interfering. This is a family matter." Dr. Green, who was leading the medical team, stepped forward. His face was grave, the years of experience evident in the lines around his eyes. Mrs. Blackwell, before we begin, I need to confirm one more time that this is truly your final decision. Once we unplug the machines, there will be no going back, he began, his voice calm but firm. Sophia took a deep breath, her face a mask of determination. I am aware of the consequences, doctor. This decision was not made lightly. It's what's best for everyone, especially for my father, she replied, her voice laden with contained emotion, pausing as she looked at Henry's motionless face. He wouldn't want to live like this, hooked up to machines with no dignity. Ethan felt anger rising within him, mixed with an overwhelming despair. How can she be so sure? How can she give up so easily? Ethan thought, before he could stop himself. The words came out of his mouth. With all due respect, Mrs. Blackwell, I don't think it's best for Mr. Blackwell. He has shown signs of improvement, however small. Can't we give him more time, he said, his voice shaking slightly. The silence that followed was deafening. All eyes turned to Ethan, some in shock, others in anger. Sophia took a step toward him, her eyes flashing dangerously. Mr. Parker, your opinion wasn't asked for. You're just a nurse, not a family member or the attending physician. I suggest you stick to your duties or leave immediately, she hissed, each word laced with threat. At that moment, the door opened again, and Jackson entered the room, his face pale and tense. He looked around, taking in the scene before him with growing alarm. What's going on here? Why are there so many people? Sophia, what are you doing? He asked, his voice shaking slightly. Sophia turned to her brother, her expression softening slightly. Jackson, you arrived just in time to say goodbye. We're about to let Dad go, she said, trying to keep her voice calm. Jackson's eyes widened in understanding and horror. No, you can't do that, not without consulting me. He's my father too, Sophia, he shouted, advancing toward Henry's bed. He turned to Ethan, his eyes pleading for support. You don't agree with this, do you? Tell me you don't agree with this. Ethan shook his head vehemently, feeling a wave of relief at finally having an ally. No, Mr. Blackwell, I don't agree. I believe your father still has a chance. He has shown signs of improvement, small but significant. If we could just give him more time. Enough, Ethan Parker, you're fired. Leave this room immediately. Your interference in family matters is unacceptable. I've given you too many chances already. Enough is enough. Leave my house now, Sophia shouted, her composure finally breaking. She turned to Ethan, her eyes flashing with anger. Ethan felt like he had been punched in the gut. Being fired meant losing not only his job but the chance to help his own mother. The tension in the room was palpable, the air heavy with unspoken emotions and conflicts about to erupt. Jackson looked from Ethan to Sophia, clearly torn between his desire to believe there was hope and the fear of clinging to false expectations. Sophia, what if? What if Ethan is right? What if Dad really does have a chance? Can't we at least consider giving him more time? He began hesitantly, putting a hand on his sister's arm. Sophia let out a bitter laugh, pulling away from Jackson's touch. You too, Jackson. Don't you see this is just prolonging the inevitable? Dad wouldn't want to live like this, dependent on machines with no quality of life. We're being selfish keeping him here. Besides, he appointed me as his legal medical proxy. There's nothing you can do, and Dad was undoubtedly right about that. You're delusional to believe there's any chance here. The doctors have already said they've done all they can. This is delaying the inevitable. As the siblings argued heatedly, their voices rising in a mix of accusations and pleas, Ethan silently approached Henry's bedside. He could feel the medical team's eyes on him, a mixture of pity and disapproval, but he didn't care. All that mattered now was Henry, and the chance, however small, of bringing him back. Mr. Blackwell, I know you can hear me. I know you're fighting to come back. Please give us a sign, anything. Your family is here. They need you. Don't give up now, not when we've come this far, Ethan whispered, leaning close to Henry's ear, his voice low and intense. The argument behind him grew louder, with Jackson now openly pleading for more time, and Sophia insisting it was time to let their father go. Doubter Green tried to mediate, his professional voice barely concealing his own discomfort with the situation. "Please, I understand this is a difficult decision, but we need to think about what's best for the patient," he said. Finally, Sophia raised her hand, silencing everyone with an abrupt gesture. "Enough, let's say goodbye. It's the least we can do for Dad before we let him go," she said, her voice thick with pent-up emotion and a finality that made Ethan shudder. Silence fell over the room, heavy and oppressive, as Sophia approached the bed. She took Henry's hand, her tears finally falling freely, breaking the mask of control she had held for so long. "Dad, you've always been my rock, my example. I know we didn't always agree, that I was often stubborn and difficult, but I want you to know how much I love and admire you. You taught me to be strong, to fight for what I believe in, and that's what I'm trying to do now. I promise to take care of everything, the company, Jackson. You can rest now, Dad. We'll be okay," she said, her voice trembling with suppressed emotion. Jackson was next, his voice choked with barely contained emotion. He knelt beside the bed, holding Henry's other hand as if it were a life raft. "Dad, I'm so sorry. Know that I fought for you and will fight until the last second. Forgive me for all the times I disappointed you for not being the son you wanted me to be. But I want you to know that I've always loved you, always wanted to be like you, even when it seemed we were on opposite sides. I'm going to miss you every day, Dad. Please, if you can hear me, know that I love you." Ethan watched the scene, his heart breaking at the evident pain on Sophia and Jackson's faces. He wanted to scream, to beg for more time, to insist there was hope. But he knew it wasn't his place, that this moment was for the family. All he could do was pray silently, begging for a miracle that seemed to grow more distant with each passing moment. Closing his eyes for a brief moment, Ethan murmured a desperate prayer. "God, if you're listening, please don't let it end this way." Samuel Green stepped forward, his expression grave and compassionate. "We're ready to proceed. Is there anything else the family would like to say before we begin the process?" he said softly, looking from Sophia to Jackson. Sophia and Jackson exchanged a glance. Years of rivalry and misunderstanding momentarily forgotten in the face of the magnitude of the moment they were about to face together. They shook their heads in unison, words failing in the face of the reality of what was about to happen. The doctor moved to the life support controls, his hand hovering over the master switch. Ethan felt his heart rate quicken, the sound of his own pulse deafening in his ears. This was it, the point of no return. Without thinking, he began to pray fervently, silent words pouring from his lips in a desperate plea. "Please, God, we need a miracle. Please, it's a life. I know I don't pray as much as I should, but please help Henry," he begged in his mind, a prayer filled with faith and sincerity. Samuel Green looked to Sophia, seeking final confirmation. Ethan saw the moment she nodded, as if it were in slow motion, each second dragging painfully. It was now or never. He couldn't stand by, couldn't let this happen without making one last desperate attempt. "Wait," Ethan shouted, his voice echoing in the silent room. All eyes turned to him, shocked by the sudden outburst. Ignoring the stares, Ethan leaned over Henry, his voice low and intense, charged with all the emotion and hope he'd been holding back these past few weeks. "Mr. Blackwell, I know you're in there. I know you can hear me. Please give us a sign. Anything. Your family is here. They love you. They need you. Fight, Mr. Blackwell. Fight with everything you've got. Show everyone you're still here, that there's still hope." The silence that followed was deafening. Ethan could feel Sophia's furious glare burning into his back, could hear the doctor's exasperated sigh, but he didn't care. His eyes were fixed on Henry's face, desperately searching for any sign of response. "Please, I believe in you. Show them you're still here," he whispered so low only Henry could hear. And then it happened. At first it was just a low hum, barely perceptible, but soon the sound grew, swelling into a frantic beeping that cut through the room's silence like a knife. Ethan whirled around, his eyes wide with shock, to the monitor measuring brain activity. The screen, previously showing only flat, monotonous lines, now displayed unusual spikes of activity. It was as if Henry's brain had suddenly awoken, pulsing with a life and energy no one believed possible. A true miracle. Ethan stared awestruck at the spikes of activity on the monitor. His heart was pounding frantically, adrenaline coursing through his veins as he tried to process what he was seeing. It couldn't be a coincidence, not after everything that had happened. The lines on the monitor, once flat and monotonous, now danced in a frenzied rhythm as if trying to tell a long, silent story. With shaking hands, he turned to Jackson, who was standing beside the bed, his voice coming out in a desperate shout. "Jackson, look at the monitor." Jackson rushed over, his eyes wide and fixed on the flashing screen. Henry's son seemed transfixed by the movement of the lines, his breathing growing quicker as he grasped what he was seeing. "My God, this is real," he whispered. Ethan nodded frantically, barely able to contain his emotion. His voice shook as he replied, "It's brain activity, your dad is responding. He's still here, Jackson. He's still fighting." Both stood there, moved, observing the clear evidence of Henry's brain activity. It was as if time had stopped, the outside world fading away as they witnessed what could only be described as a miracle. The rhythmic beep of the heart monitor, once a constant reminder of Henry's fragile condition, now seemed a chorus of hope. Jackson held his father's hand, tears flowing freely down his face, each drop carrying years of pain and regret. "Dad, you're in there, aren't you? You're fighting to come back to us. Please keep fighting. We're here waiting for you," he murmured, his voice choked with emotion. Ethan placed a comforting hand on Jackson's shoulder, feeling the tremor that ran through the other man's body. His own voice was thick when he spoke. "Dr. Green, please confirm this. I think we're witnessing something extraordinary, something that transcends the medical science we know." Dr. Green, who was about to turn off the machines, quickly approached the monitor. His face, normally a mask of impassive professionalism, now showed a mixture of confusion and intense interest. He examined the data on the screen closely, his eyes narrowing as he analyzed the activity patterns. His years of experience seemed challenged by what he saw before him. "This is unusual," he muttered, more to himself than to the others. His skilled hands adjusted some controls, as if he were trying to confirm that what he saw was real and not an equipment malfunction. Jackson pressed him, anxious, his voice trembling with hope and fear. "What does this mean, doctor? Is my father waking up? Is he going to come back to us?" The doctor raised a hand, asking for patience, although his own eyes betrayed a glimmer of scientific excitement. "Let's not get ahead of ourselves, Mr. Blackwell. These patterns are certainly unusual for someone in a vegetative state, but we need to run more tests before drawing any conclusions. The human brain is still largely a mystery to us." Delta Green began to examine Henry meticulously, his movements precise and careful. He checked his vital signs, observing every fluctuation on the monitors with redoubled attention. His skilled hands performed a series of basic neurological tests, looking for any sign of conscious response. Ethan and Jackson watched anxiously, each movement of the doctor seeming to last an eternity. The silence in the room was broken only by the beep of the monitors and the occasional murmur from Delta Green as he worked. "Doctor, have you ever seen anything like this before in any other patient? Anything that might give us an idea of what to expect?" Ethan couldn't help but ask, his professional curiosity mingling with his personal hope. The doctor paused, considering the question. His eyes turned to Ethan, laden with a mixture of caution and fascination. "Honestly, Mr. Parker, not with this intensity. It's intriguing, to say the least. I've seen cases of patients showing unexpected signs of brain activity, but nothing as sudden and pronounced as this." He turned to Jackson, his expression serious but not devoid of a glimmer of hope. "Mr. Blackwell, I'd like to run a full battery of tests immediately. Prolonged EEG, functional MRI, stimulus response tests. We need to understand exactly what's happening here. Every minute counts now." As Delta Green gave instructions to the medical team already present for the machine removal procedure, the atmosphere in the room shifted drastically. What had once been a place of farewell now buzzed with a nervous, hopeful energy. Nurses hurried to prepare the necessary equipment, their voices hushed but urgent, filling the air. Sophia, who had remained silent until this point, looking stunned by the unexpected events, finally stepped forward. Her eyes, once resigned to the impending loss, now sparked with a mixture of anger, confusion, and a flicker of hope that she seemed to be struggling to suppress. "What's going on here? I thought we'd agreed to let him go. What's all this commotion? Why are we prolonging this?" she demanded, her gaze sweeping the scene before her, as if she couldn't believe what she was seeing. Her voice trembled on the last sentence, betraying the internal conflict she was facing. Jackson turned to his sister, his face alight with a newfound hope. The years of tension between them seemed momentarily forgotten in the face of the possibility of a miracle. "Sophia, don't you see? Dad's showing signs of brain activity. He might be coming back to us. This changes everything," he asked, his voice almost childlike in its enthusiasm. Then he grasped his sister's hands as if wanting to physically convey his hope. "Think about it, Sophia. What if we get more time with him? What if we can say all the things we never said?" Sophia froze, her eyes narrowing in suspicion. The mask of control she had maintained for so long began to crack, revealing the emotional turmoil beneath. "What are you talking about? This is impossible. It must be some kind of equipment malfunction, or worse." She turned to Samuel Green, demanding an explanation, her voice laced with accusation. "Doctor, what's going on? This can't be real, can it? Someone must have tampered with the machines, maybe to give us false hope. Or..." She left the sentence hanging, unable to complete the thought. The doctor hesitated, clearly trying to find the right words to navigate this emotional minefield. "Mrs. Blackwell, I understand your confusion and skepticism. Believe me, as a doctor, my first instinct is also to seek logical, scientific explanations. But what we are seeing here is indeed unusual brain activity. I cannot explain its origin or meaning without further testing, but it is definitely something that warrants investigation. It is not an equipment malfunction, and I can assure you that no one has tampered with anything. What we are witnessing is genuine, albeit inexplicable at the moment," he began, his tone carefully neutral. Ethan stepped forward, feeling he needed to intervene. He understood Sophia's skepticism, but also knew this could be a pivotal moment for Henry. "Mrs. Blackwell," he said, keeping his voice calm and professional, "I know it seems unbelievable. Believe me, I'm as surprised as you are. But it's true, the monitor is showing spikes of activity that are inconsistent with your father's vegetative state. Samuel Green agrees it's unusual and wants to run more tests. This could be the chance we've been waiting for. The chance your father was waiting for." He paused, carefully choosing his next words. "Think of it as one last opportunity to be sure. If after all the tests nothing changes, then at least we'll know we did everything we could. But what if there's a chance, however small? Don't we owe that to your father?" Sophia looked from Ethan to Jackson, her expression a complex mix of emotions. For a moment it seemed like she might concede, but then her face hardened again. "You two, what did you do? Tampered with the equipment, didn't you? All to prolong this, to make me look like the villain. As if I wanted my own father to die," she said, her voice dangerously low, laced with an anger that seemed to mask a deep-seated fear. The accusation hung in the air, heavy and poisonous, threatening to shatter the fragile moment of hope. Jackson was left gaping, shocked by his sister's suggestion. "Sophia, how could you think such a thing? We're all here for Dad's sake. No one is trying to make you look like anything. This is bigger than our squabbles, bigger than any resentment we might have. It's about giving Dad a chance," he exclaimed, the hurt evident in his voice. Ethan felt anger rising within him at the unfair accusation, but forced himself to remain calm. He knew losing his composure now would only make things worse. "Mrs. Blackwell, I understand this is hard to believe. The situation is stressful and emotionally charged for all of us, but I swear on my life, on the life of my own sick mother, that there was no tampering. Douda Green was here the whole time. He can confirm no one tampered with the equipment. What we're seeing is real, however inexplicable it may seem," he said, keeping his voice steady but gentle. Douda Green intervened, sensing the need to defuse the situation before it spiraled completely out of control. His voice was calm but firm, carrying the weight of his medical authority. Mrs. Blackwell, Mr. Blackwell, Mr. Parker, please. I understand that everyone is emotionally invested here, and rightly so, but I need everyone to remain calm. I strongly suggest we suspend any decision about removing life support until we can run further tests and better understand what is happening with Mr. Blackwell. He paused, looking directly at Sophia. Mrs. Blackwell, I understand your concern about prolonging your father's suffering. It's a valid and compassionate worry, but as his physician, I must advise that we investigate this more thoroughly. If after comprehensive testing, there is no significant change, then we can reconsider, but at this juncture, it would be imprudent not to explore this unexpected possibility. Sophia looked torn, her face a mask of conflicting emotions. Months of stress and responsibility weighed heavily on her, making it difficult to accept this sudden change of plans. But what if this is just a reflex? What if we're only prolonging the inevitable, making him suffer more? I can't bear the thought of giving everyone false hope. Only to, she asked, her voice softer now, revealing the vulnerability and anguish behind her tough facade. Before she could finish, an impassioned debate erupted in the room. Jackson was arguing fervently for a chance to investigate further, his voice thick with emotion and pleading. Sophia, please, it's just a little more time. If there's even a chance, however small, shouldn't we grasp at it with both hands? Think of all the things we'd want to say to him, all the apologies we'd want to make, and what if we could have that chance? Sophia shot back, her voice quavering but determined, insisting they were merely prolonging Henry's suffering. You don't understand, Jackson. It's cruel to keep hope alive like this. What if he's suffering? What if he's trapped, wanting to leave, and we're holding him here? Ethan tried to mediate, offering his professional and personal perspective. As a nurse, I've seen patients defy the odds with unexpected recoveries, and as someone who also has a sick loved one, I understand the fear of clinging to false hope. But I also know the regret of not having tried everything is something that can haunt you forever. Samuel Green chimed in periodically, explaining the possible significance of the signs they were seeing, trying to bring some scientific objectivity to the emotionally charged discussion. The patterns we're observing suggest some level of cognitive activity. I cannot promise a full recovery, but it certainly warrants further investigation. The tension in the air was palpable, voices rising as emotions spilled over. It was as if years of repressed feelings, unvoiced fears, and buried hopes were all surfacing at once. The room, once a sanctuary of silence and resignation. In the midst of the chaos, no one initially noticed the subtle change that was occurring. Henry's eyes, which had remained closed, began moving more actively beneath his lids. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, his eyelids started to flutter, as if he was struggling to open them. His eyes roamed, fixing on the faces around him, catching fragmented glimpses of the scene unfolding before him. It was Ethan who noticed first. Mid-sentence, he stopped abruptly, his wide eyes fixed on Henry's face. Wait, look at Mr. Blackwell, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. One by one, they all turned, the discussion dying instantly. Sophia brought her hand to her mouth, a sob escaping her lips. Jackson leaned over the bed, his voice shaking with emotion. Dad, can you hear us? The silence that followed was deafening, everyone holding their breath, waiting, praying for a sign. And then it happened. Suddenly a guttural sound emerged from Henry's throat, low and raspy, but unmistakably real. It wasn't a formed word, but it was a conscious sound, a deliberate effort at communication. The sound echoed through the room, silencing everyone in a way that no argument could. It was the sound of life, of consciousness returning against all odds. Everyone froze, eyes fixed on Henry, barely daring to breathe. The moment seemed suspended in time, charged with possibilities and newly born hope. What would happen next? What did this sound mean for Henry's and his family's future? The answers were yet to come, but one thing was certain. Nothing would be the same after this moment. The room plunged into a deep, reverent silence, as if the very air had frozen. All eyes were fixed on Henry, each person present barely daring to breathe, fearing to break the spell of this miraculous moment. The guttural sound that had escaped Henry's throat still echoed in their minds, a vivid reminder that the impossible was happening before their eyes. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, Henry's lips began to move, trembling with the effort of forming words that had been trapped inside him for so long. It was like witnessing a rebirth, each tiny movement charged with profound and moving meaning. Ethan, acting on pure instinct and years of training, quickly grabbed a cup of water with a straw that was on the bedside table. With slightly trembling hands, he leaned over Henry, offering the liquid carefully. "Mr. Blackwell, try to take a sip. It will help your throat," he whispered, his voice barely containing emotion. With delicate movements, Ethan helped Henry take a few swallows of water. Each gulp felt like a victory, one more step toward the impossible. The room remained silent, everyone holding their breath, waiting, praying. After what seemed an eternity, Henry finally managed to form a word, his voice no more than a raspy whisper, but clear enough to be heard by all. "Wait," he said, the word carrying an immense weight, as if it contained all the thoughts and emotions he had accumulated during his long slumber. The impact was immediate and overpowering. Sophia, who until then had held firm, felt her legs give way. She sank to her knees beside the bed, a sob escaping her lips, years of control and composure crumbling in an instant. "Dad, you're here. You're really here," she managed to say through tears. On the other side of the bed, Jackson made no effort to contain his emotions. Tears streamed freely down his face as he held Henry's other hand, gripping it as if afraid his father might disappear if he let go. "Dad, we missed you so much. Please stay with us. Don't go away again." He wept openly, his voice thick with emotion. Henry slowly moved his eyes between his children, his face, though still pale and weak, showing signs of recognition and emotion. It was as if years of absence were being filled in that single moment, unspoken words finally finding expression in the emotion-charged silence. Samuel Green, overcoming his own initial shock, quickly sprang into action. With precise professional movements, he began a series of basic neurological tests, his voice calm but charged with barely contained scientific excitement. "Mr. Blackwell, I'm going to do some simple tests. Try to follow my instructions as best you can," he said, leaning over the patient. The doctor started with simple commands, asking Henry to squeeze his hand, move his eyes, try to lift his fingers. Each small response was a victory, a miracle in itself. Henry responded slowly but consistently, his movements weak but undeniably conscious. Ethan watched intently, his heart racing, barely believing what he was seeing. "This is incredible. He's really coming back to us," he thought, feeling a wave of emotion wash over him. After several minutes of careful examination, Samuel Green straightened up, a look of awe on his face. He turned to the family and to Ethan, his voice charged with amazement and professional respect. "It is with great joy and, I admit, some astonishment that I can declare, Mr. Blackwell is no longer in a vegetative state. Though he is still very debilitated and we have a long road ahead, he is definitely conscious and responsive." The impact of those words was like a wave crashing through the room. Sophia let out a sob of relief, burying her face in her hands. Jackson laughed and cried at the same time, an expression of pure joy on his face. Ethan felt his own tears begin to fall, the enormity of the moment finally hitting him. Sophia, still kneeling beside the bed, raised her face, her eyes red but glowing with an emotion beyond words. She looked at the doctor, then at Ethan, and finally back at her father. Her voice shook as she spoke, the words coming out in bursts. I need a moment, alone with my father, please." She looked at Jackson, a silent plea in her eyes. "Just a moment, brother. I need to say some things." Jackson nodded, understanding. He leaned down, softly kissing his father's forehead before rising. "We'll be right outside, Dad. We're not going anywhere." Samuel Green gently ushered Ethan and Jackson out of the room, leaving Sophia alone with Henry. In the hallway, the doctor turned to face the two men, his face a mixture of admiration and professional respect. He placed a hand on Ethan's shoulder, his grip firm and warm. "Mr. Parker," he began, his voice laden with emotion, "I must congratulate you. Your perseverance, your unwavering faith in Mr. Blackwell, was nothing short of extraordinary. The doctor paused as if carefully choosing his next words. In all my years of medical practice, I have rarely seen such dedication and insight. You did not merely tend to Mr. Blackwell's physical form, but nurtured his very soul, keeping the flame of hope alive when all others were ready to give up. Samuel Green continued, his voice growing more impassioned as he spoke. What you have done goes beyond the call of duty for a nurse. You have demonstrated a courage and compassion that are rare in this world. You faced skepticism, risked your career, all because you believed there was more hope than the eyes could see. That is the true essence of care, Mr. Parker. It is seeing the potential for healing even in most desperate of situations, hearing the whisper of life when all others hear only silence. The doctor paused, his eyes glistening with contained emotion. You have not only saved Mr. Blackwell's life, but given this family a second chance, a chance at healing, reconciliation, to say all the things left unsaid for far too long. Samuel Green's words continued to flow, each one striking a deep chord within Ethan. Your dedication reminds us why we chose this profession in the first place. It is not merely about science and procedures, but about compassion, empathy, and an unwavering belief in the human potential for healing. You have embodied those ideals in a way that will inspire not only me, but all who hear this extraordinary story. The doctor gripped Ethan's shoulder once more, his gaze intense and sincere. Young man, you have a rare gift, a gift that goes beyond medical knowledge. It is the capacity to see the humanity in every patient, to fight for them when all others have given up. Never lose that quality, Mr. Parker. It is what makes you not just an excellent nurse, but an extraordinary human being. Ethan was momentarily rendered speechless, overwhelmed by emotion and the weight of Doubter Green's praise. He felt the warmth of pride and accomplishment spreading through his chest, mingled with profound humility. Doctor, he began, his voice trembling. I only did what I believed was right. I could not give up on Mr. Blackwell, not when I sensed there was still hope. Jackson, who had stood silently listening, stepped forward, tears still glistening in his eyes. Ethan, he said, his voice thick with gratitude, there are no words enough to thank you for what you've done for our family. You've given us our father back. Before Ethan could respond, a sudden cry echoed down the hallway from Henry's room. The sound was a mixture of shock and emotion, so intense it made everyone freeze for a moment. Without hesitation, Ethan, Jackson, and Doubter Green rushed back into the room, their hearts racing with fear and anticipation. What they found upon entering left them paralyzed with astonishment. Sophia was embracing Henry, her body racked with uncontrollable sobs. But these were not sobs of grief or despair. They were sobs of relief, of months of pent-up emotions finally finding release. Most astonishing, however, was Henry. With weak but undeniably conscious movements, he was stroking Sophia's hair. His hand trembled with the effort, but the gesture was clear and deliberate. It was a father comforting his daughter, an act so simple yet profoundly meaningful after so many months of stillness. Ethan felt his throat constrict with emotion, tears once more threatening to spill. He looked to Jackson, seeing the same awe and joy reflected in his eyes. Doubter Green, ever the professional, quickly moved to check Henry's vital signs, but even he could not hide the smile of wonder on his face. In that moment, as he witnessed the scene unfolding before him, Ethan felt something shift within himself. All the struggle, all the uncertainty and fear of the past week seemed worth it for this single moment of pure human connection. He had not only saved a life, but helped reunite a family. Doubter Green's words echoed in his mind, reminding him of the power of compassion and perseverance. This, Ethan thought, his heart swelling with emotion. This is why I became a nurse, for moments like these. In the days that followed Henry Blackwell's miraculous awakening, the hospital room that had once been a place of silence and resignation transformed into a hub of constant activity and renewed hope. Henry's recovery was slow, but each small progress was celebrated as a monumental victory. Ethan, now a constant and welcome presence, watched with awe and a touch of professional pride as Henry fought to regain control of his body and voice. The first words were difficult, coming out halting and raspy, but imbued with a fierce determination. I was here all the time. Henry managed to utter on one particularly emotional afternoon, his eyes fixed on Sophia and Jackson. The revelation struck them all like a thunderbolt, the realization of what Henry had experienced during those long months, leaving them stunned and emotional. Sophia, in particular, seemed deeply affected by her father's revelation. The mask of efficiency and coldness she had maintained for so long began to visibly crumble. One afternoon, as Ethan was adjusting Henry's medications, she pulled him aside, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. "Mr. Parker." "Ethan, I need to apologize. My behavior, my stubbornness. I was so wrong," she began, her voice trembling slightly. Ethan was surprised by Sophia's sudden vulnerability, but maintained a compassionate expression. "Mrs. Blackwell, you were just trying to protect your father and your family," he replied softly. Sophia shook her head, a sad smile on her lips. "No, I was protecting myself from fear, from pain, from the possibility of losing everything." Sophia's transformation was not limited to Ethan. In a gesture that surprised everyone, she sought out Jackson, extending a hand of reconciliation. "Brother, forgive me. I should have listened to you. I should have given hope a chance," she said, her voice laden with emotion. Jackson, momentarily stunned, quickly pulled Sophia into a tight embrace. "There is nothing to forgive, Sophia. We are in this together, as we always should have been," he murmured, his voice choked up. Ethan watched the scene with a smile, feeling that he was witnessing not just Henry's recovery, but the rebirth of an entire family. Henry, though still frail, seemed to gain strength with each passing day. His determination to recover was matched only by his desire to see his children reunited once more. On one memorable afternoon, he managed to gather enough strength to speak for a longer period, his voice still raspy but full of fatherly authority. "Sophia, Jackson," he called, gesturing for them to approach the bed. "You are my legacy. More important than any business," he paused, taking a deep breath before continuing. "Promised, oh, you will work together, as a family." The siblings exchanged a look, years of rivalry and resentment melting away in the face of their father's words. "We promised, Dad," they said in unison, their hands intertwining over Henry's. Ethan's tireless dedication did not go unnoticed. One morning, as he was performing routine care, Henry beckoned him over with a weak gesture. "Ethan, you saved. More than my life, you saved my family," he said, his voice stronger than in previous days. Ethan felt a lump form in his throat, moved by the acknowledgement. Before he could respond, Sophia walked into the room, an unusual smile on her face. "Mr. Parker, you're being promoted to head nurse of special care with a substantial bonus," she said, her voice carrying a tone of respect that wasn't there before. Ethan was momentarily speechless, the realization of what this meant for him and his mother hitting him with full force. As the days turned into weeks, Henry began sharing more about his experience. His words, though still slow and sometimes difficult, painted a vivid and harrowing picture of trapped awareness in an unresponsive body. "It was like suffering without being able to speak," he described one afternoon, his eyes distant with the memory. "I could hear, feel, but I couldn't respond." Ethan listened intently, taking detailed notes. "Mr. Blackwell, your experience could help so many other patients. Are you willing to share more?" he said gently. Henry nodded slowly, a glint of determination in his eyes. "If it can help others not go through what I did, yes." Henry Blackwell's story soon spread beyond the hospital walls. Journalists began gathering in the reception area, eager for an exclusive interview with the man who came back from the dead. The medical community was also intensely interested in the case, seeing in it potential implications for the treatment of patients in similar states. Samuel Green, now a constant presence, coordinated the requests for information and studies. Mr. Blackwell's case could revolutionize our understanding of consciousness and altered states. "It's a monumental breakthrough," he explained to Ethan during one of his rounds. As Henry gained strength, Ethan found himself taking on an increasingly central role in his recovery. He was no longer just a nurse, but a confidant, a vital link between Henry and the outside world. "Ethan," Henry called him one afternoon, his voice stronger than ever. I want you to continue being my personal nurse throughout the entire recovery." Ethan felt a wave of pride and responsibility wash over him. "It would be an honor, mister." "Blackwell, I'll be here every step of the way," he replied, his voice thick with emotion. Weeks turned into months, and with each passing day, Henry made remarkable progress. His speech became clearer, his movements more coordinated. The intensive physiotherapy, combined with his own iron determination, began to bear visible fruit. On one particularly memorable day, Henry managed to stand for a few seconds, supported by Ethan and Jackson. The room erupted in applause and tears of joy, the emotion palpable in the air. "This is just the beginning," Henry said, a tired but triumphant smile on his face. As Henry's recovery progressed, Sophia and Jackson began working together to reorganize the family's businesses. What was once a source of conflict now became a joint project of renewal and growth. Ethan observed with satisfaction, seeing how adversity had forged a new dynamic between the siblings. "I never thought I'd say this, but working with Jackson has been surprisingly rewarding," Sophia commented to Ethan one day as she reviewed some documents by Henry's bedside. Jackson, overhearing the remark, grinned widely. "Who would have thought, sister, that almost losing our father would finally make us understand each other?" The impact of Henry's story on the medical community was profound and long-lasting. Researchers from around the world began studying his case, seeking to better understand the mechanisms of consciousness and how to improve diagnosis and treatment of patients in similar states. Samuel Green, now one of the leading experts on the subject, often consulted Ethan about his observations. "Your instinct was right, Ethan, and it may change the lives of countless patients in the future. Never underestimate the power of intuition combined with medical knowledge," he said in one of those consultations. As the months passed, the idea of creating a foundation to research altered states of consciousness began to take shape. Henry, now able to actively participate in the discussions, was the project's biggest enthusiast. "I want our experience to help others. No one should go through what we went through," he declared at a family meeting. Sophia and Jackson readily agreed, seeing in the foundation an opportunity to give a new purpose to the family's resources. Ethan, invited to take part in the discussions, felt a wave of emotion as he realized the potential impact this initiative could have. 6 months after Henry's miraculous awakening, the Blackwell family organized a special ceremony. The hospital's event hall was elegantly decorated, filled with healthcare professionals, journalists, and prominent figures from the medical community. At the center of it all was Ethan, still uncomfortable with all the attention, but deeply touched by the recognition. Henry, now able to stand for longer periods with the help of a cane, made a point of delivering the award to Ethan personally. "This young man not only saved my life, but gave me back my family. His dedication and compassion are an example for all of us," he said, his voice strong and clear, filling the hall. Ethan, emotional, accepted the award with trembling hands. Looking out at the audience, he saw familiar and new faces, all united by the incredible journey they had shared. His mother was there, healthy and radiant, thanks to the treatment Ethan's bonus had made possible. Sophia and Jackson stood side by side, their genuine smiles reflecting the new harmony in their relationship. Samuel Green nodded encouragingly, a gleam of pride in his eyes. "Thank you. This award is not just mine. It belongs to all of us who never lost hope, who believed in the power of compassion and perseverance," Ethan began, his voice choked with emotion. As Ethan concluded his speech, announcing his decision to continue his studies to specialize in cases of altered consciousness, he felt a profound sense of purpose and fulfillment. The journey that had begun with a simple act of faith and compassion had evolved into something much greater. Looking at Henry and his family, at his colleagues and mentors, Ethan knew that this was not an end, but a new beginning, a beginning full of possibilities, of lives to be touched and changed. This, he thought, to smile spreading across his face, is just the first chapter of a much larger story. Each life is precious, he said in his acceptance speech, and every consciousness, however hidden it may be, deserves our attention, our care, and our unwavering hope. What began as an act of faith turned into a revolution of compassion and understanding. May we never forget the power of believing in the impossible and fighting tirelessly for those who cannot fight for themselves. As Ethan's words echoed through the hall, Henry, Sophia, and Jackson exchanged looks of pride and gratitude. What had begun as a family tragedy had turned into a legacy of hope and healing that would continue to touch lives for generations to come. And at the center of it all was Ethan Parker, the young nurse whose compassion and determination had unleashed a wave of change that no one could have foreseen. As I sit back and reflect on the story of Henry Blackwell and Ethan Parker, I can't help but feel a strong sense of perseverance and belief in the goodness of life, even when everything seems lost. The challenges we face in life, no matter how difficult, can sometimes bring miracles we never thought possible. Henry is not just an example of resurrection in life, but also a reminder that sometimes the seemingly impossible can become a reality. This story has made me realize that no matter how tough fate may seem, with persistence and belief, we can still change everything. I believe this story helps us reassess our lives and realize the value of family, love, and unity. These are truly invaluable lessons for all of us. If you've been moved by this story and want to continue following more inspiring stories like this one, don't forget to hit the subscribe button on our YouTube channel so you don't miss out on any future videos. We'll continue bringing you stories that inspire, full of humanity, and always offering hope for life. Be a part of our community and share these touching moments with others. Thank you for taking the time to watch, and we look forward to seeing you in our next video.